Greetings, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program, Framing U.S. History, a conversation about where our country's past and the truth, and the classroom collide. My name is Marcia Eli. I'm the Director of Programs at the Center for Brooklyn History. Behind this digital curtain is an extraordinary panel, and I'm very eager to hear what they have to say. But before I turn it over to them, I want to share a word or two about the Center for Brooklyn History. We are a proud part of the Brooklyn Public Library. We hold the most extensive collection of Brooklyn-related materials in the world. And every week, we offer free public programs through the library's programming arm, BPL Presents, which itself offers an extraordinary range of free talks and concerts and performances and family programs and much, much more. I really hope you'll go to the Brooklyn Public Library website and look for BPL Presents and find out what's coming down the pike. Tonight's topic, who gets to control our country's historical narrative, the struggle that is in constant play between the past portrayed in, say, the 1619 Project and what has come to be called patriotic history, is huge and hugely important. And it's our plan at the Center for Brooklyn History to follow up tonight's conversation with related programs. Another reason to keep your eye on what's coming up. But also consider sharing your ideas on the topic, who you'd like to hear from, conversations you'd like to see staged. Use the email in your webinar confirmation to let us know your thoughts. A few final notes. First, I want to thank my colleague, Margie Cook, for helping to bring this program to all of you. And finally, I want to invite you to share your questions tonight. Use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator and thank her, and she in turn will introduce everyone else. Ansley Erickson is Associate Professor of History and Education Policy and Co-Director of the Center on History and Education, Teachers College, Columbia University. She is the author of the book, Making the Unequal Metropolis, School Desegregation and Its Limits, which won the 2017 History of Education Society's Outstanding Book Award. She also co-directs the Harlem Education History Project, which draws on Harlem's rich tradition of Black educational visions to inform just education for the future. Thank you, Ansley. Thank you, everyone. I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Marcia. I appreciate the chance to be here and to be here with this wonderful group of people. One of the reasons I am so excited to be with you this evening actually goes back to your use of the word huge. When we think of the tumbling of a statue of a Confederate general or a statewide textbook fight over how to represent the lives of enslaved people, the scale of our conversation about history seems huge. But as teachers know, teaching and learning are in fact really small scale activities, resting on the thousands of near microscopic decisions that teachers and their students make in their classrooms each week. Part of why I think this conversation that we're going to have tonight will be so rich is that we have a panel of people who can think across those scales, the huge to the tiny, as theorists and as caring humans in their own classrooms. So let me introduce you to this wonderful panel. First up is Errol Saunders II, who is a 15-year veteran history teacher and the Executive Director of Pathfinder at Hopkins School, an educational nonprofit that prepares students from New Haven public and parochial schools for high school success. Hopkins is a private college preparatory coeducational day school for grades 7 to 12, located in New Haven, Connecticut, and it's the third oldest independent secondary school in the United States. Errol holds a BA in political science from Yale University, an EDM in curriculum and teaching from Teachers College, Columbia University, where I'm pleased to get the chance to work with him. And he's currently a doctoral student in that department. Good evening, Errol.
Good evening, Ansley. Thank you so much for that great introduction. I'm excited to be here.
Welcome. Next up, I'd like to introduce Hasan Kwame Jeffries, who is an associate professor of history at the Ohio State University, where he teaches courses on the civil rights and Black Power movement. He is the author of Bloody Lowndes, Civil Rights and Black Power in Alabama's Black Belt, and the editor of Understanding and Teaching the Civil Rights Movement, which won the 2020 James Harvey Robinson Prize from the American Historical Association for the most outstanding contribution to the teaching and learning of history in any field for public or educational purposes. He also wrote and narrated the 10-episode Audible original series, Great Figures of the Civil Rights Movement, released in February 2020. Dr. Jeffries served as the lead historian for the $25 million renovation of the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. He is also the host of the podcast, Teaching Hard History, American Slavery, a production of the Teaching Tolerance Division of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Good evening, Dr. Jeffries, and welcome.
Good evening, and thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to it.
Likewise, thanks for being here. And finally, I'd like to introduce Kerry Foraker Green, who is a public school educator in Dallas County, Texas, where she teaches secondary US history and dual credit US history, and is an educational partner with Dallas College. She earned an MS in history and an MS in organizational learning and technology from Texas A&M University Commerce. In addition to teaching, she is a doctoral student at the University of Texas at Arlington in the Educational Leadership and Policy Studies program. Welcome, Carrie.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here.
So I think what we're going to do tonight is I have a couple of questions that I hope everyone will take some time to respond to. And as we're doing that, people who are viewing should feel free to add their questions in the Q&A. And once we've had some conversation amongst us, then we'll open it to questions that come in from the audience. So when we were talking before this gathering, we talked about some of our goals for this conversation and wanting to encourage everyone here with us tonight in their own critical thinking about their own history knowledge and about the narratives that they might take as settled or taken for granted. And if we want to encourage that reflection, then what better way to do that than to model it, right? So I thought, if you're willing, that I'd ask you to share a story about yourself as a learner, as a history learner, about a time that you had to unlearn or substantially revise something that you thought you knew about the past, right? What was that process like for you? I'm hoping that perhaps Professor Jeffries will start us off.
Absolutely. Well, that's a great question. And as a son of Brooklyn, born and raised in Crown Heights, one of the things that I grew up learning, and as a baseball fan, was about the Brooklyn Dodgers. I was too young to have been here, to been alive when the Dodgers played in Brooklyn, but my dad and my uncle were huge Brooklyn Dodgers fans, and I grew up with this version of the history of the Brooklyn Dodgers that had them being sort of Brooklyn's home team. And then, in the dark of night, Walter O'Malley, the owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers, sort of taking the team away and taking them off to play in Los Angeles. And what a sad and dark day for Brooklyn. And had it not been for Walter O'Malley, the Dodgers would still be here in Brooklyn, perhaps playing right downtown where the Barclays Center is now. And I grew up with many a year thinking about that and hearing that story, as many, no doubt, Brooklynites and residents of New York would know as well. But the truth is that the Dodgers were on their way out of Brooklyn in the late 1950s, leaving in 1957, because white residents of Brooklyn were on their way out of Brooklyn, had been leaving for the better part of the decade as a part of the white flight out of the central cities and moving, in this instance, to southern Connecticut, moving to New Jersey, moving to Staten Island. And so what the Dodgers were actually doing was chasing their white fans. And when they disappeared from Brooklyn, they in fact chose to move to Los Angeles, again, in search of these suburban white fans and different opportunities. And so in a way, the story of the Dodgers leaving New York and leaving Brooklyn wasn't one of a ruthless entrepreneur baseball owner but rather a reflection of the shifting dynamics and racial dynamics and racial demographics in the city that really spoke to what would be a new urban America in the post-World War II era. So I needed to do a whole lot of unlearning in order to make sense of what modern New York, what modern Brooklyn, contemporary New York actually looked like.
Thank you for that great example. Carrie or Errol, who would like to pick up from there?
I don't mind, if that's okay, Errol. So mine is, pretty, it's not as interesting as the Brooklyn Dodgers, but mine really has to do with the role of white women. I had grown up, and this kind of merges a little bit with the lost cause myth, although I always kind of knew that was a little bit exaggerated. But when I began to really look into the women's rights movement and began to understand what actually happened, and then recognizing the role that white women played in keeping Black women out of power, pushing, and that it just keeps happening. And that has probably been the biggest revelation, whether you're talking about Phyllis Schlafly, whether you're talking about Alice Paul, whether you're talking about Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I think it's just really fascinating when you look at American feminist history, the role that white women played in kind of trying to use their whiteness as a way of leveraging power. And so that was a huge, I didn't know that. I started working on my history degree and thought, oh yeah, feminism, cool. And so then I started to uncover some of that dirty history that was women, not treating other women very well. And so that's probably been the biggest thing. And I'm constantly interested in those narratives and how they play out even in the modern sense. You look at, Stacey Abrams is a classic example of a woman who really flipped that narrative and changed has come in and didn't need white women to do that. And I think that's an amazing example of why we need to understand how feminism fits within our racial history.
Thank you. I'm wondering, so I have lots of questions for both of you about these stories that I'm going to hold because I want to make sure that we can hear from Errol. But I'll share that the question that I'm wondering about is how did you go in pursuit of this unlearning or relearning, or did it just come upon you, right? And probably some of both, but it might be interesting to hear about that. So Errol, to you, please.
So I think for me, this kind of transformative unlearning experience was about the docility of the enslaved. I learned a narrative of most enslaved persons just kind of accepting their life as enslaved, that the kind of the rules of enslavement in America were predominantly rules created by white people to serve white interests. And it wasn't actually until I had to start teaching enslavement that I started to learn so much more about the constant threat of and threat of rebellion and actions that the enslaved were constantly taking to resist enslavement, right? That actually did quite a bit to shape what enslavement looked like, right? So, and that started, that starts way back in, African ports, where some ports had 1 in 4, 1 in 3 ships engaged in rebellion. And it fundamentally changed how white enslavers went about the slave trade, right? And so just really trying to wrap my head around why was I taught that enslaved persons were mostly just okay with it, right? And I didn't have the I didn't have a narrative that the enslaved liked being enslaved. So that was good. California did a great job at that as a kid. But this idea that everyone just kind of accepted their lot and that just was what it is. And then suddenly Abraham Lincoln freed them all. And they're like, oh, what do we do now? As opposed to the constant resistance that was happening from, from the 1500s onward.
Mm. Thank you so much. Professor Jeffries or Carrie, are you interested in commenting any more on the sort of pursuit of these unlearnings, or should we move to a next question? I'll leave it to you.
Well, I'll just add, I think you had pointed out, Ansley, that it is a mix of both, right? I mean, as all of us as educators, we never stop this process of learning, right? Even in teaching, we're constantly learning. We're learning from our students, no matter how old they are, what their age, what school, what level they are. So I think for us as educators, we're constantly in this pursuit of learning. In that particular example, I was obsessed with the nostalgia of it, right? I have a friend, Reggie Gibson, a literary performer, and he says, we as Americans actually hate history. What we love is nostalgia. Nostalgia makes us feel comfortable about those difficult stories of the past. And so sometimes we get caught up in the nostalgia, and that masks the truth. And so sometimes, in the search for truth, we have to do some unlearning in order to see it and truly understand it. And so I absolutely think it's a mix of both. Sometimes it's what we're looking for, and sometimes it's just what we stumble upon while we're searching for the truth.
Thank you so much for that great point.
I would echo that, and I would just say you have to be open to that cognitive dissonance too. You have to self-reflect about, oh, this makes me uncomfortable. Why? And go past that and go through it, because too often the path of least resistance is just to put something down and say, I don't want to learn more. And I think that keeps you going on that path of unlearning.
Thank you.
I just would add that the role my students played in my unlearning, right? There was a question from a student that caused me to go, oh, wait, I'll have to get back to you about that. Like, what's going on, right? And just being really open to the idea that your students, your job is to teach them, and also your students are getting you, pushing your inquiry and pushing your learning quite a bit every day. And your moral obligations to your students to be able to answer that question truthfully, or to be able to engage with any particular material in a way that is just and reflects what actually happened. Is really integral to this kind of unlearning process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in my experience, that happens in graduate school classrooms as well as it does in classrooms with younger people, certainly. So in these stories, we've got some familiar and powerful parts of the US history curriculum and things that also get narrativized, right? We've got the teaching of enslavement. We've got the teaching, potentially the reckoning with the lost cause narrative. We have the ways cities change and who's active in them, right? And what the consequences are. I want to build off of the really powerful term, the master narrative, that Julian Bond gave us in thinking about the civil rights movement, right? Naming a way that a story about a moment in history can sort of take over and get in the way of deeper, richer, fuller accounts. He's thinking about the civil rights movement there. But I think if we take that notion of master narrative and consider it in other places and other parts of our history teaching, what are some of the master narratives that you find yourself struggling against in the classroom? Carrie, do you mind starting us off on that one?
Sure, of course. So to me, the one, and it's not so much a specific narrative as it is kind of a theme, which is the unity of thought versus unity of purpose, where people want to believe that the United States is united, and that means we all think alike and we all agree and we're all going in the same direction. So whether you're talking about, regional development of the colonies, whether you're talking about the American Revolution, whether you're talking about, the Mexican-American War, Civil War, on and on and on. I mean, World War II. We so often just want to talk about, oh, we were unified, when the reality is there is not unity of thought in the United States. There's always a tension. going on between different groups of people. Now, what we do see is a unity of purpose. And sometimes, and I think that's an important distinction to try to describe to students how we can do things like World War II, or even the civil rights movement. When you contrast, you know, the SCLC and the Black Power movements, I mean, there's a unity of purpose, but it's not a unity of thought. And I really, I want to challenge my students to really recognize that it's okay to not think the way everyone else thinks, as long as we're ultimately striving to be better and to fulfill the values of our country.
Thank you. Professor Jeffries, would you like to pick up that thread next?
Yeah, certainly. I think one of the master narratives, or an element of the broader master narrative of U.S. history that I find myself constantly having to push back against in the classroom, is the myth of perpetual racial progress. That yes, there was a moment in time where there was racial disharmony, but by golly, we as Americans, we always push beyond it, right? Slavery existed, but we ended it. There was this thing called Jim Crow, but we got Dr. King. And then we had some trouble around Black Power, but we got Barack Obama. Like this idea that things always get better, almost by default, without struggle, without change, without pushback, just merely by the passage of time. And so in the classroom, I really work hard to get my students to understand that, yeah, change occurs. There are absolutely moments of progress, but they only occur as a result of people fighting hard and people fighting for change. And they occur in the face of very virulent and often vicious opposition. And so getting our students to understand that, for me, is one of the things I have to really work hard to get them to see.
Thank you. Errol.
So one of the narratives I have to deal with in my classroom, especially being in Connecticut, is this kind of innocence of the North with regard to racial strife, enslavement, and endemic racism. And so, you know, it's really funny. One of the things that's really nice about being in a city that's very old is I can tell stories that are very old that you might interpret in one way as going with that innocence. So for example, William Lanson, New Haven's first Black millionaire, was in the 18 teens. You're like, oh yeah, that's great, right? He happens to know he happens to know a senator who is white and gets his millions through a government contract. Oh, that's great too. 10 years later, he is destitute, having been relieved of all of his wealth through the machinations of jealous white people in town, right? And so he's both the first Black millionaire and a story of this kind of white resistance to Black progress in the North, in a city that they know that they live in, right? With examples like neighborhoods that we know here in New Haven, in one way, had been historically Black neighborhoods, and then asking folks why isn't Worcester Square a Black neighborhood in the way that it used to be in the 18 teens? And what does that say about our kind of complicity in the North in these kind of racial narratives?
Thank you. Yeah, I can't resist that when I was asking you this question about these unlearnings, I was remembering sitting in a lecture hall in New York as someone who grew up in Georgia, learning about the seriousness of a secession conversation in New York City in the 1850s, and thinking that upends everything I think I know about region. And I'm also in graduate school learning this for the first time, right? Not a high school student, not a college student. So I really appreciate this question about region and the ways that that Northerners, the long story about Northern racial innocence and its power in our curriculum.
Yeah.
Carrie, go ahead.
Texas has quite a bit of that. You know, Texas did a lot to remake their version of history. You know, from being a Southern cotton slave economy to, oh, we're all Western cowboys. when that wasn't, the story is a lot more complex than that. And a lot of my students just assume that the Western cowboy theme is what dominates Texas history. And so it's always, the reason for the Texas Revolution is really because they wanted to keep their slaves, and Mexico was going to put limitations on that. So it's always kind of interesting. So those narratives exist just so many different places.
Thank you. So I think I'm going to ask you all one more question. And at that point, I think we'll turn to those that come from the audience. I see a few coming in, and I'm sure that more will. So having started by saying that I think that teaching involves thousands of small human scale decisions, I wonder what you would say to our viewers about how you make those choices, right? For you as an educator, what's a principle? I'm sure there are tons of them, but what's a principle that you would like to share with people as an example of what guides you in making the complicated choices you have to make in your own classroom or in your own teaching in other forms? Errol, since you have gone last the last few times, would you like to bat first, to use the Dodgers metaphor?
Sure, absolutely. I'm really glad to get this question first, because I actually have a slide of my moral commitments to my students when we're talking about tough subjects. And so I have 3 guiding principles to that. One, I let them know very clearly that I'm not going to position myself as sympathetic to oppressors, whether those are oppressors of people like me or oppressors of other people. So my students know for sure where I stand on a subject. If you think there's oppression there, if it looks like there's oppression, I'm not going to be sympathetic to those folks. The second thing is, I am going to be sympathetic to my students as learners, right? It is not their responsibility living in the kind of milieu that we are, of all the different conflicting stories that may or may not have a relationship with truth. It's not their responsibility to, once they know where I stand, to shut up, right? So we give them lots and lots of opportunities. In Zoom school, those opportunities often happen in email and chat, right? And I encourage my students, after when we're talking about things, I always start with, my thesis is, this is how I'm interpreting the evidence, so that they understand that history isn't received. It's argumentation based on facts, and welcome them to push back upon those if the reasoning doesn't make sense, or if they have other facts that I am not aware of. Right. And then the third thing is a commitment that we are all going to make mistakes. Right. That if we create community norms around language, talking about the enslaved as we're studying transatlantic enslavement, and then someone doesn't do them or makes a mistake, we gently remind, and then we move on. If there's a rupture where like we need a very uncomfortable moment, we're going to sit in the moment, we're going to stop what we're doing, we're going to talk about the moment, but we need to respect each other as learners, including me making mistakes. So those three kinds of ways, those 3 ideas guide how I take my students through these kinds of conversations and the kinds of decisions I make on the day-to-day.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you have a slide. Carrie, would you like to pick up from there?
Sure. So I have a quote that is my driving message, and it comes from Graham Swift's Waterland. What is a history teacher? He's someone who teaches mistakes. While others say, here's how to do it, he says, and here's what goes wrong. While others tell you this is the way, this is the path, he says, and here are a few bungles, botches, blunders, and fiascos. It doesn't work out. It's human to err. He's a self-contradiction, an obstructive instructor, a treacherous tutor. And that has always spoken to me. I really feel like that is my role as a history teacher, is to challenge the narrative of my students. And I think that speaks, kind of dovetails with what Errol's talking about. You have to have respect, right? Because sometimes, that cognitive dissonance creates an issue. So you have to approach it respectfully, and you have to model challenging those stories and demonstrate for them what that looks like. And so I think that treacherous tutor line has always just resonated with me, and that's really how I see my role.
Thank you. I have sometimes started a class with another Graham Swift quote, in the sort of assertion that man is a storytelling animal, right? Which I love because it reminds us that all of us, whether consciously or not, are doing this work of putting ourselves someplace in the trajectory of history, and that we're constructing these stories, which is to say that there's nothing foreign about encountering narratives, right? We're building them all the time. So hopefully we can work from that premise to help build more constructive ones, right? So Professor Jeffries, would you like to have the last word on this theme?
Yeah, and my guiding principle is simply teach the truth. No matter where that takes us, no matter how that makes us feel, we have to, and I have to, teach the truth. I think one of the things, especially when, I teach courses in African American history, civil rights movement and the like, and so essentially about race. And one of the things that makes teaching and learning about race and racism in American society so challenging is that it is so personal, not just for Black folk and people of color, for white folk as well. And the vast majority of my students at The Ohio State University are white. And so when asking them and exploring these topics, I'm actually requiring that they have to do some personal introspection because of the things that they have learned, not only about society, but who has taught them these things, folk that they have respected and the like, and they're still learning. So I'm like, look, I'm not here to necessarily change anybody's mind, but I am here to open everyone's mind. And I do that simply by standing on truth. Now we can interpret meaning from there, but what you're going to get from me is the truth, as far as I see it, based upon facts. But that's our starting point in my classes.
Thank you all. This has been such a rich conversation so far, and we've generated a lot of questions. So I'm going to turn to some of those now, and we'll keep the conversation going. In some cases, I might want to send these to one of you individually. In other cases, we'll just open them to everyone. Deborah asks, so how do you teach the concept that the interpretation of history has changed over time, and help students to think about history for themselves in a balanced way? And additionally, how do you make it feel relevant to students today in that process? Let's see. So Carrie, do you want to start us off there?
Sure. So I think that you just keep constantly reminding them. Primary documents are the most amazing way to do that, because and it's the, dare I say, safest way, because if I'm giving students primary documents to look at, it's not me saying this, this is what I think happened. They're looking at documentation and they're making their own decisions about that. And so I think that's a really powerful way for students to kind of engage with that history. And then my role then is to curate those primary documents, is to make sure that I'm pulling in stories that are teaching a broader perspective, right? And then that I make it relevant to students by connecting what we're learning in class with what's happening in the real world. And so with the recent stimulus bill that just passed, I'm teaching the New Deal right now. And so we had a really great conversation talking about how the Recovery Act, how it fits within this idea of not only what the New Deal was and what the New Deal was trying to accomplish, but then also kind of this idea that, we're competing ideas about the New Deal. And then my plan for later this week is to look at some of the complicating ways that the New Deal failed, for example, like the Agricultural Adjustment Administration and the consequences of that. And so we're going to kind of deep dive into some of that stuff later this week. So, but that's how you make it relevant, is you try to just constantly connect it back to what's happening.
Thank you. Dr. Jeffries, would you like to comment further?
I would only add that one of the things that I do, and this picks up on Carrie, your theme of connecting it to the present, because our kids, we're making history every day. We're witnessing history every day. And even in their lives, no matter, I mean, especially by the time you get to upper elementary school and certainly by middle school, they've been consciously aware of history and the process of making it. And so those become sort of, the touchstones that you can tease out, again, with primary sources and interpretation, and saying, hey, well, this is how some people interpreted it. This is how others interpret it. Here's some evidence. What's the conclusion? And so I think not being afraid to talk about and teach the current moment is a great way to get students to understand how history, quote unquote, is made.
Thank you for those really helpful illustrations, I think, and examples. I want to bring in a different and really wonderfully broad question that comes back to the framing that I offered at the beginning about unlearning. Susan asks, asking the American public to unlearn everything they have been taught seems like a daunting task. How do you see a nationwide unlearning being accepted by a very skeptical public? Which is a great question. Errol's unmuted, so.
I'm really excited about that question because I actually don't think it's a daunting task. I actually think that the American public isn't skeptical in the kind of broadest sense. I think we're learning new things every day, right? And since we're learning new things every day, it's actually, I think, the first step to unlearning the things that we have had foisted upon us that are false in the past is to just stop teaching those things, right? So the first step for me is to make sure that in my classroom and in my, with my nieces and nephews and with my family, that when I learn something or unlearn something, to share it with other people. I think we saw over the summer quite a bit of that kind of thing, where people were learning a thing or unlearning a thing and then sharing it with their family members, who then shared it with their family members, who then shared it with their friends, who then sought out more information, right? Because I think primarily Americans want to be able to explain their world, right? I think people want to be able to explain their world, getting back to this storytelling capacity, right? And there are some fundamental contradictions with the master narratives that we have and how they don't explain our world. So when you provide some people with new information, right, they take it up. Not everybody, but they do. And then you're more likely to take up new information from people that you have a trust relationship with. So that kind of each one teach one idea, I saw it happen this summer. I mean, people are taking up unlearning and learning new things about about the narratives that they know.
Thank you. You were ready to go, and I'm glad you were able to share those thoughts. Dr. Jeffries, please.
Yeah, I'm glad Errol was ready to go, because I had to think about that for a second. And I agree with what he was saying in the sense it's not daunting in the sense that we're not actually asking people to unlearn everything, right? The Constitution happened, right? The Constitution is real. People wrote it, but I need you to step away from this notion that these were great men, right? And who were thinking about abolishing the institution of slavery in 1787. Like, no. The Constitution is there, right? We're not going to pretend that it's not, but we're also going to look seriously at the ways in which protections for maintaining the interest in maintaining the institution of slavery and personal economic interest in it were built into the Constitution. So it's not that we have to absolutely unlearn everything that we've ever been taught. It's just a matter of looking at those elements, taking what is actually true, these basic facts, and of course, people interpret facts in different ways, but the Constitution, some guys got together and created it, yes. But now how are we going to interpret that, right? And that's where the work has to be done. So it's not that we're erasing, obviously not erasing anything, right? But we're just saying we got to look at these different elements in different ways. If we approach it with an open mind in that sense, I think it becomes more manageable, a little bit more digestible, and the process becomes achievable.
Thank you. Carrie, I'm wondering if you want to join the conversation if you'd like.
Sure. What the thought that popped into my mind when Errol was talking was that, I was just looking at the Annenberg Center did a study, kind of checked civic understanding, and they were saying how much civic understanding had increased over the last year. And so, or in 2019, rather. I think that was 2019. And so it's, to me, what that says is that relevancy piece that, and to Errol's point, that it's not daunting, because when people see relevance, they want that information. Like, oh, wait a minute, I don't understand, impeachment. So let me go find out about impeachment. So I do think it's very possible to do that. The key is to for people to have access so that they can explore those ideas when it becomes relevant and that sort of thing. So I absolutely think that it's a doable thing. And it's just a question of getting the right, pieces, the right information, and kind of having that larger conversation.
And Ansley, can I add something?
Please.
I think it's important to note too that there's a substantial percentage of the population. We have people, let's just say we have people who are also equally invested in maintaining these false narratives. And that's a challenge because it's not just simply a matter of providing the truth to people who just don't know. It's a matter of how do we engage with people who refuse to acknowledge the truth or acknowledge it and refuse to shift and change the narrative. And that's sort of a different challenge. And that has real political implications, has real world implications for how people are able to live in this society. And I think it has real implications for us as educators, because our students are constantly being bombarded with thoughts and perspectives by those who are intentionally trying to perpetuate narratives that just aren't true.
Yeah, I would echo that. I was just reading earlier today a piece from Zeus Leonardo, where he's analyzing Charles Mill's racial contract and applying it to education. And that's exactly what you're talking about. He's saying that the use of language, the use of the narrative, the use of the things that we're doing in the school are reinforcing these power structures. And that fundamentally it's about a racial contract or a broken social contract. And education has to be willing to kind of change itself. And he called them epistemological traitors, which I thought was a fascinating phrase, to challenge those narratives, because those power structures want to maintain power, and they will propagandize the issue to make it suitable for them.
But that's where I get back to the kind of romanticism of being a history teacher, right? The romanticism, for me, the romanticism of being a history teacher is this sense of optimism that knowledge about the past is something that people take up and is something that can change the world, and that the kind of discordance, for me, that discordance between what people are hearing on television and what they are hearing from someone that has developed a strong, loving relationship with them, right? And that is engaged in a journey of learning, that discordance is where we can see these changes happen, right? Because otherwise, it is a little bit. I would think it would be daunting, right? Or there are people who are interested in the status quo and false narratives. But one of the things that's really wonderful about children is that sometimes they don't realize it. Sometimes if they do, they're much more open to kind of trying to get their head around it, right? And they're willing to ask questions, right? They're willing to ask questions and engage in ways that I think adults have a harder time.
Thank you. I mean, this conversation about the political weight of these narratives, of people attached deeply to potentially untrue or damaging narratives about the past, leads me to want to bring this question in because it asks us to engage directly the structures of the state and which are very powerful in constraining the work of many teachers, right? Janet asks, what do we do about the textbooks that are selected for classroom instruction by districts and states that contain, and she's using the title of James Lowen's famous book, Lies My Teachers Told Me. Dr. Jeffries, please.
Yeah, if I could just say real quick, and all I want to say is to echo what Carrie had said earlier. You shift towards primary sources. Primary sources become so critical to offer a counter narrative that is rooted in these sort of historical realities and historical truth. So my quick answer is exactly what Carrie said. It's primary sources all the way.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason, teaching in Texas, New York Times did that comparison with the California textbooks and the Texas textbooks. And, you have to intentionally decide that I'm going to bring in these primary documents. And that's how I do it. I make sure I teach my standards, right? Because ultimately that is my contractual obligation, is to teach my standards. But if I'm teaching that standard and I'm bringing in the primary documents and I'm using those primary documents to cause them to dig deeper into those standards, then that's what I need to do. Now, the challenge, particularly for states like Texas or some of the other states that have very kind of strict, standards. And one of the things that I've also observed is the role of standardized testing, right? So when you're like, I teach 11th grade US history, it's a tested subject. So I have a contractual obligation to make sure that I've exposed my students to what those standards are going to be. And, and so I have to do that. And yet, right, you can deepen that. But how do teachers that are overworked, have large class sizes, teach, especially in social studies, the propensity of coaching in there, how are they going to have time? So to me, I see the biggest issue is not, yes, some of the state standards are problematic, but I think even more so, it's the time issue, because I think individual teachers can find ways to work with, through, around, in spite of those standards to do what they need to do. But if they don't have time, like they are allowed to sleep and like see their families and that kind of thing. And I see that as the biggest issue.
Mm. Thank you. Yeah.
You can also use textbooks that you disagree with as provocations by doing exactly what the New York Times did and comparing them, and having that comparison be the provocation for students to go into the primary sources, right? Many students, not all students, but many students are perfectly aware that there is a hidden transcript to education, right? That there is the answer that they're supposed to know, that's the right answer for the teacher, and there's the real thing. And so with my students, I actually am pretty straightforward with them about this. I was like, this is the narrative that we've been told. This is, I use a textbook that thinks that America is all about a particular expansion of liberty over time. And, this is one narrative. This other book has this other narrative. Let's look at this one particular section in the two books, and then let's go to some sources and figure out how do we get to tell that story and how do we get to tell this story? And so then the kind of standard becomes a provocation for an understanding of history as not received, as history as argumentation about the past, as history as the stories we tell each other.
Thank you. Yeah, I think with Carrie's point about time, and which also, which speaks to labor and care and all of the things that go into that time. I'm thinking about a question that came in about how teachers tend and care for their children, their students, in facing some of the difficult history that they might encounter, for example, in primary sources or in other spaces. So Tizak asks, what about feelings raised by these topics on your students? Deep historical issues have an impact on our identity and may bring up feelings of distress or discomfort. What do you do then? Please, Dr. Jeffries.
Well, my students are a little older, so I'm getting them as college students. Early, and the point behind the question is a real one, because we're dealing with very difficult subjects. I had, as I was transitioning, as many of us were as teachers, to the era of Zoom. I had starting teaching a course on the civil rights movement this past semester. I started out literally having my students watch the documentary film Slavery by Another Name, as we're sort of exploring the Jim Crow era. And after I assigned it, a student emailed me and said, Dr. Jeffries, this was a really powerful film, but there was some material in there that was really hard to digest. It's talking about lynching and racial violence and racial terror and the like. And she said, it would be, I think maybe that you should, and some material that was triggering. I think maybe, you should, provide a trigger warning to your students. And I said, thank you very much for reminding me. I usually say something at the top of the class, but in the Zoom era, I had simply forgotten about it. And so when we met for class again, I said, the student raised this issue. And I said, I need you all to understand something. I am going to provide you a trigger warning. This is the trigger warning. This is American history. It is rough, right? In the way in which we're going to talk about it. We're talking about racial violence. We're talking about terror. All of it. We're talking about people who are getting robbed. And they were like, this is it. Like, whatever you think may be triggering, welcome to US History 101. And the students, when you lay it out like that, it is, right? It's tough. It's just hard history, right? This is difficult. But if I think as teachers, if we don't try to hide it, don't try to massage it, right? And we obviously in age appropriate ways, but we're honest and we're clear. And we're like, this stuff, I get kids who cry in class all the time. It's like, all right, we're going to go there. But the point is not just to make you feel bad or feel ashamed or feel shameful in some way, shape, or form, but to acknowledge that and then say, what can we learn from it? Where are we going to go from it? After we have those feelings, what are we going to do with them? What are we going to learn? And what questions now do we have? Not only about what haven't we been taught and learned about in the past, but what do we need to learn about going forward?
Thank you.
I would say, I teach, high school, and you do have to be cognizant when you're talking about difficult subjects. And I'll be the first to admit I haven't always done it perfectly. And that has been a part of my growth as a teacher, is learning, I guess I'm used to analyzing those things. And like Dr. Jeffries said, I understand that is American history, but for people who are new to the subject, they may not appreciate that. And when they're teenagers, especially teenagers in, 2020, 2021, everything, the pandemic, the shifts, all that kind of stuff has really created a lot of stress. So you do have to be very cognizant of what's, of how you're saying things. And I think the biggest thing that I've taught myself is watch popping off. I always get myself in trouble when somebody asks me a question and I throw an answer right back at them, because if I'm thinking ahead, the role, it doesn't mean I plan every minute or that it's scripted, but if I just know what my intent is for that particular lesson, then that helps me think about the areas where students might be sensitive. And then just constantly read the room. And that's, but Dr. Jeffries is right. It to some extent, it's hard to do that. But yeah, giving them agency is another big part of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Errol helped us think earlier about creating a space where people can make mistakes and be supported in thinking through them, which I think is really valuable to this conversation as well. So the question though of what you do after those feelings, after the emotions of anything from pain to shame to many of the others that we could imagine history inspiring in students, as well as joy, as well as appreciation of beauty, right? All of these things are there. the shift to action. We have a listener who said, how do you connect questioning history to being an active citizen? Which I think is a wonderful question. Errol, would you like to start us off on your thinking about that? And if not, you can pass to someone else.
So I was actually just trying to think about as if there were one thing that I was doing to connect questioning history to being an active citizen. I think part of our job as history teachers, as kind of public intellectuals with regard to the past, is modeling what we're doing, right? Modeling that we're questioning these things, modeling that we are engaged civically, modeling our values and how our values are connected to our understandings of the past and to the things that we do in the present, right? And I just refuse to be a partial person with my students. And I think that has been very valuable for them, right? Connecting students, when a student makes a comment about something that they're interested in history, connecting them with a thing they can do today that's related, right? When students are asking me particular questions about history, thinking through like, where do we see that in our world right now? As well as what is the answer to the question that you're looking for. Really thinking about, being very deliberate about the idea that the project we're in is explaining our world for the purpose of deciding if it's the one we want to be in, right? And that's actually day one, why I study history, no matter what level I'm teaching, and we engage in that discussion, right? That like, I am uninterested in making you learn about a bunch of dead people for the mere sake of learning about a bunch of dead people. But I want you to be able to explain your world for the purpose of deciding if it's the one you want to be in. And for you to imagine, and this is like a Maxine Green idea, for you to be able to imagine a different future, imagine a different sort of sociality. And of course, I don't use the term sociality with my ninth graders, but for you to imagine the world being different and then thinking about how you would make that happen. Whether it's through your term paper, it's through your social action project, it's through the volunteer work that you're doing on the weekends, through the conversations you're having with your friends outside at lunch.
Thank you so much. We have time, I think, for only one more of these great questions from viewers. And this one, I think, is the perfect place to end because it's actually a request for suggestions for more. What kinds of curriculum and professional learning are available to support the teaching of hard history in the ways that you all have so eloquently described? Where can teachers and leaders get started? And I think that's a great invitation to share resources that you all are connected to and let people know where they can keep learning.
Well, I'll give a shout out to Dr. Jeffries. I shared this. I was listening to his podcast months ago, and he was talking about, how you show, racial violence, right, and the depiction of lynching, and the suggestion was, you block out, you put a box over the victim, right, and you focus the conversation on the people that are staring at the victim. And so I actually applied that this year, and it created a great conversation. And I think rightly so, it puts the emphasis on why would somebody do that? Why would somebody watch that? And what must be happening in society if that's okay? And so I think resources like Teaching Hard History is a great one. And I know I personally, go through Gilder Lerman and multiple NEH, and I'm just constantly looking for things. And even Zen Education Project has some amazing role plays. So if you're needing to pull something out and you're like, man, that has some, you just have to build a repertoire. And I would strongly suggest not only signing up for every kind of like listserv about history, but follow them on Twitter and, Stanford Education, all that kind of stuff. And you'll find that you'll just be scrolling through one day and, oh, hey, you know, something comes to your email. And I think that makes it easier to find those resources. And then as far as from a leadership perspective, I think there has to be a will to encourage teachers to have that conversation. And I think that's going to look different in different districts, depending on their constraints. But there's really has to be a will from the leadership to drive that conversation.
Thank you so much. Errol and I have been trying to add things to the chat in case people need text versions of these ideas. Errol or Dr. Jeffries, would you like to add any other suggestions?
So Carrie, as I was thinking of them, she was just naming them. I was like, oh. So, I decided that the way I would be useful is to put the links to some of the things that she was saying in the chat. One of the other things that I think, and I know this gets back to Carrie's point about time. So I know I'm asking for more time in some ways, but really seeking out a professional community of like-minded educators who want to know these things. You can either do that through the Twitter. You can do that surreptitiously at department meetings. You can, post on Craigslist if that's what you have to do to find other educators who are interested in social justice, who are interested in hard history, who are interested in, Gilder Lerman and how to use primary sources in your class in ways that really provoke students to think carefully about the history that they've received. And so really thinking about that professional community that you have, because that professional community will both bring you resources, right? You can pool them, but also can help fill your cup during those times where you're discouraged, right? Where an administrator said something to you because you were doing the right thing and now you're not sure. Or you need to know how to navigate the situation with a student who is really pushing back, right? Like, yes, you can read about that, but talking to someone who in a trusted member of your professional community, I think is even better.
Thank you, Errol. Dr. Jeffries, I think you'll have the last word on this one and then we'll wrap up.
Oh, my last word is simply that Kerry was right. She named the critical ones. Errol was right in explaining the significance and importance and what we need to be doing. So thank you, Carrie and Errol, and Ansley, thank you to you for really just shepherding us through this conversation and to this particular point. So thank you. Just that's my final word of it. Thank you. Yes, they're right. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And it's been a pleasure to be here and to hear all of these really powerful ideas expressed clearly in ways that generated a lot of thoughts from our viewers. I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to get to what I think are 46 questions, but we've gotten to some of them. And as Marcia said, the conversation will likely be continuing in events that the Center for Brooklyn History is planning. So I want to say thanks to everyone here and thanks to our host, and then we'll say goodnight. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.